All right, so this should be working. Um, so we're going to talk about photosynthesis and cell respiration and fermentation. But first, let's talk about photosynthesis and cell respiration, just the overview of how they are related. Okay, so we're going to fill out this diagram, and to make it easier to read, I'm going to use red ink to fill in the blanks. Okay, so it all starts with the sun. All right, so the sun has what we call light energy. And light energy from the sun is going to come down to Earth, and it's going to be absorbed by these things called autotrophs. And these autotrophs are going to take the sunlight and they're going to combine it with a couple of other things to create food for themselves and a waste product. Now, this process is called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis happens inside of an organelle called the chloroplast. So that's where it happens. You need to know where it happens. It's in the organelle that is inside of every plant cell called the chloroplast. Well, inside of the leaf cells called the chloroplast. That's where it happens. Now, what gets made by the autotrophs when they do photosynthesis in their chloroplasts is this stuff called glucose, which the plant is going to use as its food source. Plants do eat food, they just make their own food. That's what photosynthesis is, right? This is the food, glucose. And they also make a waste product called oxygen, which luckily for us, we breathe in, right? So plants make that for us as a waste product. They don't need it, they release it into the air, and then we breathe it in. But let's talk about glucose for a second. Glucose, the reason why I have this here is you notice they have 6 C's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is, each C stands for carbon. The only reason I drew this is because it's going to come into play here in a second. So you need to know that glucose has 6 carbon molecules. In fact, the molecular formula for glucose, because you're going to need to know this too. This is something that's important to know, is C6H12O6. Sometimes you'll just be shown this and you're expected to know that that is glucose, C6H12O6, okay? That means it has 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms, okay? So this glucose has 6 carbons. I'm just drawing the carbons. I'm not going to draw 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. Just look at the 6 carbons, okay? Now that glucose molecule in plants is going to get, we are going to eat the glucose, right? So us people, we're going to eat glucose either from the plant, or an animal is going to eat glucose from the plant, and then we're going to eat the animal. But either way, we're eating, when we eat food, we're eating glucose, okay? And glucose comes from plants. You can either get it directly from the plant or from an animal that ate the plant. Either way, you're getting it, okay? So when you take in glucose by eating it, something happens called glycolysis. So glycolysis is when you take a 6-carbon glucose and you split it in half into 2 3-carbon molecules that we call pyruvate. So all pyruvate is it's half of a glucose. And how do we get from the whole to the half? When we cut it in half, that's called glycolysis, okay? All right, so you eat the glucose and you also breathe in the oxygen that came from the autotrophs. And what you do is you do something called, you and all the other heterotrophs do a process called cellular or cell respiration. Cell respiration is what heterotrophs do because we can't make our own food like autotrophs can. autotrophs make their own food from photosynthesis. We have to break down that food through cell respiration, okay? Now, this happens inside of heterotrophs, but where specifically? Well, it happens in a place called the mitochondria. The mitochondria is an organelle, which is an organ of the cell. It's one of the many organelles in your cells that do different jobs. And the mitochondria's job is to make energy. And this is how it does it. It does it by doing cell respiration. What is cell respiration? Well, it's when we take in glucose and oxygen into the cell, into the mitochondria of the cell, and we use it to make things. One of the things that we use that we make is this energy molecule that we call ATP. That's really what we're after. Us heterotrophs, when we do cell respiration in our mitochondria, what we're really wanting is to make lots of ATP. What is that? ATP is energy. So when I say ATP, that is energy. Same thing. So we make ATP or energy, but then our bodies keep that. But we also make other things. The things that we make are CO2, which you breathe out, and water, which your body could either absorb if it needs it or becomes excess and is released as urine. Now, when we breathe out CO2 and make excess water and pee it out, well, the CO2 is going to get reabsorbed by the autotrophs. And the water is also going to get reabsorbed by the roots, right? And the autotrophs are going to take the CO2 and the H2O, combine it with light energy from the sun, and use it to make glucose and oxygen. And then we're going to eat the glucose, and we're going to breathe in the oxygen, and we're going to do cell respiration in our mitochondria to make energy, which we need to power our bodies, along with CO2 and H2O, which go back into the plants, and so the cycle continues, okay? So the things that get made by photosynthesis, these two things here, these are what we call products. Products are things that get made. So these get made by photosynthesis. These are the products of photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen. But the products of photosynthesis, the things that photosynthesis makes, are also the reactants. They're the products of photosynthesis, but they're also, and they are what we call the reactants of cell respiration. And what are reactants? Well, reactants are the things that go in. So the things that are going into the heterotrophs, into the chemical reaction, are the reactants, and the things that get made are the products, okay? Likewise, the things that heterotrophs make by doing cell respiration, these are the products. So these three things are the products. Well, really, your body never releases ATP. It holds on to it, so we're not going to circle that one. We're just going to circle these two. So these two are the products of cell respiration. And the products of cell respiration are also, and they are also the reactants of photosynthesis. So what I need you to understand is, what I'm trying to get at is that the products of photosynthesis are also the reactants that go into cell respiration. And the products of cell respiration that get made are also the reactants that go into photosynthesis. So the products of one are the reactants of the other in both cases. And there's one other thing that I need to tell you about, and it won't take long, and it's something that's called fermentation, okay? So you know how we take glucose and we combine it with oxygen? Well, that's called cell respiration, but sometimes our bodies might be low on oxygen. So when this happens, our bodies do this thing called fermentation. If you've ever worked out really hard or ran a long distance, you know that your muscles start to feel like they're cramping, like they're catching on fire, and they start to get hurt, right? Or they start to get sore and then they hurt, right? Well, the reason for that is because your body is low on oxygen and your body is now doing fermentation instead of cell respiration because it's low on oxygen. So what's happening? Well, in fermentation, what we're doing is we're combining glucose and CO2 instead of oxygen. So CO2 is being used to break down the glucose into pyruvate and used to make energy. The problem is that you make very little ATP when you do this. So fermentation makes very little ATP. Okay? So that's why whenever you are working out or you're running and your muscles start to cramp and feel like they're on fire and they get sore, you eventually have to stop because you're literally out of energy. Your body can't make it fast enough. And so that burning feeling actually comes from this stuff called lactic acid. And lactic acid is a byproduct of fermentation. So when your body does fermentation, because it's low on oxygen, so it uses CO2 instead, not only are we making very little ATP, but we're also making this stuff called lactic acid, which is what actually makes your muscles feel like they're on fire. So this is what we call lactic acid fermentation. There's another kind of fermentation that doesn't happen in people, but happens in like yeast, where yeast do this thing called alcoholic fermentation. We're not going to get too much into alcoholic fermentation, but basically that's how alcohol is made, is where yeast uses the same process of sugars and CO2 to make energy for themselves, but instead of making lactic acid as a byproduct like we do, they make alcohol as a byproduct, okay? And that's how alcoholic beverages are made, but we're not going to get too much into that. So that is everything you need to know about photosynthesis, cell respiration, the overall concepts, how they're related, and also fermentation.